Hi, boys and girls and parents. I hope that you are all doing well. I hope that you are having a good week, and I hope that you are continuing to enjoy time together as a family, that you are getting a chance to go outside and enjoy this beautiful weather, and that you're still having some time for some schoolwork. Again, I am here to help you with anything that you need as far as your schoolwork. Make sure that you are taking time to read at home, that you are trying to get on Dreambox and Lexia, trying to do at least 2 Dreambox lessons a week, and that you are also having some time to just do fun stuff and enjoy this free time together. We're going to start by looking at the story called Amphibian Alert. This is the first story in the packet for this week. When we go through this story, we're going to be looking at main ideas and details for the different sections of the story. Let's start by reading some background here. Did you know that the fire salamander shown below lives in Hungary? Do you have any idea what a newt looks like? It's the little reddish creature you see on page 131. This text introduces you to many amazing amphibians and the sad fact that some of them are disappearing from this world. It also suggests ways to help them. Setting a purpose. Read the text to learn about the amazing life cycles of amphibians and how you can help these creatures survive. And as we read, we're going to underline text that explains what amphibian means and circle details about the bodies of amphibians at different stages of their lives. Okay, so let's start reading. Frogs, toads, salamanders, and newts are amphibians. The word amphibian means double life because these animals live part of their lives in water and part of their lives on land. Okay, we just found the part that tells us what an amphibian is. And that's what we are supposed to underline. So let's see, it's right here. The word amphibian means double life because they live part of their life in water and part of their lives on land. An amphibian starts life in the water and then lives on land as an adult. Amphibians lay their eggs in the water. These eggs do not have a hard shell. They are more like jelly. Young amphibians that hatch from the eggs look very different from adult amphibians. The young breathe with gills. They have tails that help them swim. As young amphibians grow, their bodies change. They grow legs. Lungs develop and their gills disappear. These changes allow amphibians to live on land and breathe air with their lungs. The skin of amphibians is not protected by hair, feathers, or scales like other animals. Their skin is permeable, which means they can absorb air and water through their skin. Okay, we found a few details that we can underline that talk about how amphibians are different when they're young from when they're old. Okay, here are a few things. It talked about how when they're young they have gills and they have tails, but when they're old, their lungs develop. So they no longer breathe through gills underwater, they now breathe through their lungs and they can live on land. Okay, their gills disappear. Okay, I think that's all to underline so far. You can also write what the vocab word scales means over here. Okay, let's keep reading. Amphibians are found on all the continents except Antarctica. They are ancient animals that have been around for about 360 million years. However, their lives are being seriously threatened in today's world. Here is another vocab word, threatened. Write down what you think that means. Scientists know of approximately 6,000 different kinds of amphibians, but this number could change quickly. Scientists say that more than 120 amphibian species have already disappeared from the world. These kinds of amphibians are extinct, meaning that all members of the species have died. Many different things are threatening the lives of amphibians, including habitat loss, pollution, introduced species, and a parasitic fungus. Scientists say that 2,000 to 3,000 of the amphibian species in the world are now threatened with extinction. It is the biggest extinction crisis in today's world. Okay, our last vocab word is habitat. And now before we go on, let's think about what has the main idea been in what we have read so far. So the main idea is what this section of the story is mostly about. So what has it mostly been about? Well, it has been about amphibians, but more specifically, what has it told us about amphibians? Well, it's told us what amphibians are, and it's told us some of the problems that amphibians are facing. It has also told us how amphibians are different when they're young to when they're old. So I'm going to think of a way to write that. Let's say amphibians change as they grow up or as they mature. I think that's the main part of what this was about. And then I could include some details. So what are some ways that they change? Well, they develop lungs as they get older instead of having gills. What else? They live on land as they get older, and when they're young, they live in the water. And they have tails when they're young, but they go away when they're older. All right, there's also a question down here for you to answer. It says, reread lines 1 to 35. Why might amphibian species be especially threatened by extinction? Cite evidence from the text to support your answer. Okay, so we're writing why we think amphibians might be more likely to become extinct than other types of animals. Okay, let's go to the next page. Here we have some new things to underline and circle, and we're going to have a new main idea because this is a new section of our story. As you read, collect and cite text evidence. Underline the reasons amphibians need clean water. Circle the paragraph that explains how some ponds and creeks get polluted. Underline text that explains problems caused by the African clawed frog. Okay, here we go. Habitat loss and pollution. Amphibians often live in swamps and ponds, but many of these swamps and ponds are being filled in to make way for roads, houses, and malls. Amphibians also live in rainforests that are being cut down or destroyed by fire. The loss of these habitats often leaves the amphibians nowhere to live. Okay, so this is explaining some of the ways that amphibians' habitat can be destroyed. Clean water is extremely important to amphibians. Adult amphibians need clean water to keep their skin moist. Adults lay their eggs in water, and young amphibians live completely in water. Okay, so let's see. Is there anything to underline or circle yet? Underline the reasons amphibians need clean water. It talks about that right here. Adult amphibians need clean water to keep their skin moist, and adults lay their eggs in water. And young amphibians live completely in water. So that's 3 reasons why amphibians really need that clean water. We also have a vocab word here, moist. You can write down what that means. Some ponds and creeks are close to farms. Chemical fertilizers are used on farms to grow better crops. Pesticides are used to kill insects and destroy crops. However, when it rains, these chemicals are washed into the nearby ponds and creeks that lead to swamps and rivers. Many frogs in these areas have been found with deformities, such as a missing leg or extra leg. Deformed frogs like these have been found in 44 of the 50 United States. Some scientists believe that the chemical pollution in the water is absorbed by the soft eggs of amphibians and by their permeable skin. The chemical pollution affects the eggs and growth of the young, causing these deformities. So when there is pollution in the water from the pesticides, that gets sucked into the eggs or into the skin of the amphibians, which then makes them sick. So let's see, we were supposed to circle the paragraph that explains how some ponds and creeks get polluted. Well, it talks about that right here, where it talks about the pesticides getting into the ponds and creeks. And then the last part was underlined text that explains problems caused by the African clawed frog. And we have not talked about the African clawed frog yet, so we'll have to keep reading to figure that part out. We can write what fertilizers and absorbed mean, however. Okay, before we go on to the next section, I'm going to write the main idea of that last section. And looking at the title can really help us with that. So that section was mostly about habitat loss and pollution. So it was about how pollution causes habitat loss for amphibians. And habitat loss means that they have lost their home. They no longer have a safe place to live. And pollution, we know all about that. Pollution can be from pesticides, getting in the water like we talked about, from fires, from exhaust, from trash. All those different things cause pollution. And some details about that. Well, we know, just like we just said, pollution comes from pesticides in the water or from fires. And those things cause the amphibians to lose their homes or become deformed, where they lose a leg or have extra legs. Okay, next part. Introduced species and fungus. Since the 1930s, American clawed frogs have been shipped around the world by the thousands. These frogs are used in laboratory studies and for other purposes. Some exotic amphibians are shipped to other countries as pets or for food. Sometimes these amphibians escape or are released into their new habitat. In their new habitat, they can cause problems. The introduction of African clawed frogs into new areas has caused two major problems, and this is the part that we're going to underline. African clawed frogs are more aggressive than many frogs, and they have been known to eat other frogs. But the bigger problem is that African clawed frogs carry a fungus called amphibian citrid. This fungus does not hurt African clawed frogs, but it is deadly to many other kinds of amphibians. Scientists discovered this fungus in 1993. In the wild, the fungus is unstoppable and untreatable. It can kill 80% of the amphibians in an area within months. Scientists suspect that dozens of frog species have gone extinct because of this fungus. Okay, so what are the problems with the African clawed frog? Well, first, it sometimes is aggressive towards other frogs and it might eat them. And also, It carries a fungus that kills amphibians. Let's answer this question. What is an introduced species and how can it be dangerous to other species? Cite evidence from the text to support your answer. Okay, so an example of an introduced species was the African clawed frog right here. So if you can look back at that example, that will help you to answer that question. Okay, before we read our last section here, well, our last two sections, let's write the main idea of that last section. So what was that section that we just read mostly about? Well, it was about how introduced species might endanger amphibians. Okay, and what are some examples from the text of how that might happen? Well, we have the African clawed frog. And what does the African clawed frog do? Eats other frogs and carries a fungus, and that fungus can also kill amphibians, as we talked about. Okay, the next part is plans to help. We're going to underline what scientists and conservation groups are doing to help save amphibians, and we're going to circle what you can do to help save amphibians. So what scientists do and what you can do. Plans to help. Scientists and conservation groups from around the world are putting plans together to help save amphibians. Much of their work focuses on the amphibian citrid fungus because the disease it causes is the most serious and immediate threat. Some scientists are researching how the disease spreads and why it kills only some individuals in one species, but kills all of another species. Okay, so I found something that scientists are doing. Do you see it? It's where it says some scientists are researching how the disease spreads. That's the way that they're trying to help less amphibians die from this fungus. Other scientists are assessing the damage the disease has caused. So that's something else that they're doing. The areas most affected so far include Central America, the Caribbean, Australia, and parts of Asia. However, scientists warn there is no continent or amphibian species that is safe. Conservation groups that include many zoos are taking in many of the threatened amphibian species to protect and preserve them. So there's something else. Zoos are taking in the species to make sure that they don't become endangered in the wild. In the future, when the research scientists find ways to control the disease, the conservation groups will release these animals back into their natural habitat. Okay, and we're going to group this section with the last section when we do our last main idea in detail because they kind of go together. They're about very similar things. Like scientists, you can do research and learn as much as you can about the problems facing frogs and other amphibians. So there's one thing you can do. You can do research. You can search the internet using search words such as threats to frogs and amphibians for more information. You can find maps and lists of the amphibian species in your area. Amphibians live all over North America and in every state of the United States. The Appalachian Range is home to many different species. Contact local nature preserves, zoos, or the Office of Environmental Matters in your state to learn about volunteer opportunities. So here's another thing that you can do, is contact those zoos to learn about how you can volunteer. You can also help by keeping local ponds and creeks clean. Okay, so here's another thing. Although these small habitats may not seem as important as others, they are home to many creatures. We need to help preserve a future for them as well as for us. Okay, let's finish our last main idea. So what was our last main idea? Well, we first learned about what scientists are doing, and then we learned about what we can do to help amphibians. So we could say how scientists and others can help amphibians. Okay, and what are some details or examples of how we can do that? Well, we talked about doing research. We can do that, and scientists are doing that. We can volunteer to help at a zoo because those zoos are taking in those endangered species. And we can clean and help keep the environment and the habitats clean for the amphibians. And our last question, how are scientists' efforts to help save amphibians different from those of conservationists? Use text evidence to support your response. So you will find your answer to this question on that last page that we were looking at, where it talks about first what scientists are doing, and then down here what conservation groups are doing. So you need to compare and contrast those two things and how those different groups are acting. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Next, we will look at the next story in this packet.